I knew who my son was going to become before he said a single word to me. I want to start there, because everything about this story depends on that specific, terrible foreknowledge, the particular weight of waking up inside a life knowing exactly how it ends, not for yourself, but for someone 10 years old, sitting in the next room, who has not yet done any of the things that make the name Ethan Cole, in the novel I once read, a name that makes characters flinch whenever it appears. He was not a villain yet. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters enormously when you are talking about a child. He was 10 years old. He liked, according to the memories I inherited along with this body, building elaborate structures out of whatever materials he could find, and he was methodical about it in a way his teachers found impressive, and his mother, the woman I had apparently become, had apparently never once acknowledged, because she was almost always somewhere else when the structures were finished. I was in her kitchen, in her apartment, in her life, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I processed the impossible fact of my own existence here, when I heard him come in from school. The door opened. Footsteps, quiet and deliberate, the footsteps of a child who had learned not to announce himself. A pause in the hallway. I understood, listening, that he was checking whether she was home before deciding whether to speak. He had clearly, at some point in the past 10 years, learned that it was better to determine the emotional temperature of a room before entering it. "Mom," he said, careful, flat, the voice of a child who had stopped expecting anything in particular from that word. "In the kitchen," I said. Another pause. Then he came in, small for his age, dark-haired, with eyes that were doing that very specific thing children's eyes do when they are deciding, in real time, whether the person in front of them is safe. I looked at him. He looked back. And I thought, very quietly, so quietly it barely felt like a thought at all. Not this time. This is that story. I want to tell you about the Ethan Cole I had read about, because understanding who he was supposed to become is the only way to understand why the version of him standing in that kitchen doorway frightened me so completely. The novel had been a school drama, the kind of story set in the brutal social ecosystem of a high school, where the stakes feel impossibly large even when the world outside those walls has already moved past caring about them. The villain of the piece had been Ethan Cole, 18 years old by the time the story reached its crisis point. Calculating, cold in the specific way of someone who had learned that warmth was a liability, a systematic dismantler of other people's social worlds because his own had been so thoroughly demolished, years earlier, that he had stopped believing in the possibility of building anything that wouldn't eventually be taken apart. The book hadn't spent much time on his backstory. Villains rarely get backstories, in the kind of novel that moves quickly toward its own resolution. There had been a chapter, near the beginning, that sketched him in outline. A mother who worked long hours and came home distracted and had, according to the one person who knew him well enough to explain him to the reader, just kind of stopped being there, even when she was in the room. A father who wasn't in the picture. A boy who had decided, at some point in his early childhood, that needing people was a mistake he would not keep making. I had read that chapter, in my old life, and turned the page, because the story had more interesting things to get to, and Ethan Cole's childhood was just context, just the mechanism of making him plausible. I thought about that chapter differently, standing in a kitchen that was his kitchen, in a body that was his mother's body, looking at a 10-year-old who was looking back at me with the specific careful flatness of someone who had already, at 10, learned to keep people at a distance he could manage. I thought. That chapter was about a child. And the child is standing right in front of me. I want to be honest about the first evening, because I think honesty matters more in this kind of story than in any other kind, and because the first evening was not what I'd have written if I'd been writing it from the outside. I didn't immediately transform into a perfect, warm, effortlessly attentive mother. I want to say that clearly, because the version of this story where the transmigration simply installs a better personality alongside the new consciousness would be both more comfortable and considerably less true to what actually changing looks like. What actually happened was, I asked him what he wanted for dinner, and he looked at me with that careful flatness and said, whatever, and I understood, in the specific weight of that single word, that whatever was not indifference. It was a child who had learned that expressing a preference about dinner led to one of two outcomes. Either his preference was noted and forgotten, or it was noted and resented, and either way it would have been better, smoother, easier for everyone if he had simply not had one. I'm asking because I'd like to make what you actually want, I said. Not whatever's easiest. What do you actually want? He looked at me for a moment. Pasta, he said, finally. Still flat. Still careful. Okay, I said. Do you want to help, or would you rather do homework first? Another pause. the pause of a child recalibrating, trying to figure out whether this question had a right answer he was supposed to guess. Homework first, he said. Okay, I said again. Dinner in an hour. He went to his room. I made pasta and thought about the chapter in the book, and thought about the 10 years that had already happened before I arrived in this life, and tried to understand exactly what I was working with and how much of it could still be changed. The honest answer, I suspected, was more than the book had ever bothered to find out. I spent the first week learning the shape of the life I'd woken into, the way you learn a room in the dark, carefully, touching each surface, building a picture through contact rather than visibility. Claire Bennett, the name on the lease, on the utility bills, on the 2 professional awards hanging, slightly crooked, in the home office, had, by any external measure, built a successful life. Marketing director at a mid-sized firm, well regarded by colleagues, the kind of professional track record that looked, from a distance, like a person who had everything organized. What she had not organized, I found, in the quiet of the first week, was Ethan. Not through cruelty. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because I think the easy version of this story makes Claire a monster, and I do not believe she was one. I think she was a person who had built a life around the things she knew how to do, and parenting a child who needed presence more than provision was simply not, in any complete way, something she had figured out how to do. His school reports, in a folder in the home office filing cabinet, told the story more clearly than anything else I found. Intelligent, organized, methodical. Teachers noted, consistently, that Ethan rarely participated in group activities and had few close friendships. One teacher, in a report from the previous year, had written, Ethan appears to prefer working alone and can be reluctant to ask for help when struggling. His academic performance is strong, but I'd welcome a conversation about how he's doing more broadly. He sometimes seems very self-contained for his age. There was no indication, in the filing cabinet, that Claire had ever followed up on that invitation. I called the school the following week. Mrs. Park was perhaps 45, with the specific patient energy of a teacher who had been doing this long enough to recognize, immediately, that a parent calling to ask about her child's social well-being was either routine or significant, and had learned, through experience, to treat it as significant until proven otherwise. I'm glad you called, she said, and I could hear, underneath the professionalism, a small, genuine relief. I did put that note in his report last year. I wasn't sure it had been noticed. I should have called sooner, I said. I'm sorry I didn't. There was a brief pause, the pause of a teacher recalibrating, having expected something more defensive. Well, she said, you're calling now. She told me what she knew. Ethan was, academically, in the top third of his class without appearing to try very hard. His work was always technically correct but rarely personal, rarely the work of someone who had taken a risk. He sat at the edges of group activities rather than their centers. He was polite to other children in a way that kept them at a consistent, managed distance. She had seen him, once, help another student with a problem they were struggling with, and the quality of attention he gave in that moment had surprised her. Patient, genuinely engaged, entirely different from his usual careful remove. He has a lot of capacity for caring, Mrs. Park said, at the end. I think it's there. I just think he's decided it's safer not to use it. That's what I think too, I said. What would help? What would actually help? Honestly, she said. A parent who shows up. Not to fix anything dramatic, just consistently present. Children like Ethan, in my experience, don't need intervention. They need someone to prove, over and over again, that being noticed is safe. That's really the whole of it. Thank you, I said. I'm going to try. I want to be honest about what trying actually looked like in the first 2 weeks after that phone call, because the version of this story where good intentions translate immediately into good results would be both comfortable and false. The first week, I cooked dinner 3 nights and was home by 6 every evening. Ethan sat across from me at the table and ate with the same careful flatness he applied to everything, answering my specific daily questions with answers that were truthful but minimal, not evasive, just economical. The responses of someone allocating the smallest unit of engagement that still technically satisfied the social requirement of a response. On Thursday of that first week, I had a crisis at work, a client presentation that needed emergency revisions, an email chain that demanded 3 hours of uninterrupted attention, and I sat in my home office with the door half closed, phone calls stacking up, entirely absorbed in the kind of professional emergency that Claire Bennett's life had clearly been organized, for years, around treating as the highest possible priority. Ethan knocked on the office door at 7:30. Dinner? He asked. I looked up from my screen. He was standing in the doorway with the particular careful blankness that I had, over the past weeks, started to understand was not blankness at all but its opposite, an expression he had practiced into something that looked like nothing, because showing something and having it not matter had, over years, cost more than showing nothing at all. "I'm sorry," I said, starting to get up. I lost track of time. "It's okay," he said. Quickly. The quickness of someone preemptively managing a disappointment they've already absorbed. "I can make cereal." And there it was, the moment I understood, with a cold precision that had nothing to do with any novel I'd read, exactly how deeply the pattern was embedded. He had not waited to see whether I would actually follow through before offering me the out. He had offered it, immediately, reflexively, the way you offer an umbrella to someone you already know is about to say they forgot theirs. Not from generosity but from long experience of the particular weather of this person's attention. He had, at some point years before I arrived in this life, stopped believing that asking for something was worth the risk of the asking. "No," I said, "I'm coming. Give me 5 minutes to send one email." He looked at me for a moment. That same careful assessment I'd noticed on the first day, checking for the gap between what was said and what would actually happen. I sent the email. I closed the laptop. I went to the kitchen and made pasta, the way he'd asked for on the first night, and we sat at the table, and I did not check my phone once in the 40 minutes we ate dinner together, even though I could feel the unopened messages piling up on the other side of the room like a physical weight. He didn't mention the work crisis. He didn't say anything at all about the near miss of the evening. What he did, near the end of dinner, was tell me, unprompted and in more than 3 sentences, about something that had happened in his science class that afternoon, a small story, nothing remarkable, the kind of story children tell when they've decided, provisionally and with clear ability to revoke the decision at any moment, that the person across the table is currently worth telling things to. I listened to every word. The breakthrough happened in the 3rd week, on a Saturday afternoon when the weather had turned gray and neither of us had anywhere to be. I had been, for 3 weeks, doing what Mrs. Park had suggested, showing up. Present in the kitchen when he came home. At dinner, actually at dinner, with the phone face down. Available, in a way Claire's memories told me she had rarely managed, for the specific unimportant conversations that children offer as tests before they offer the important ones. He had, for 3 weeks, remained carefully flat. Polite. The same managed distance, applied at home with practiced efficiency. I found him in his room, in the middle of an elaborate construction project using cardboard boxes, tape, and the internal components of a broken clock radio he'd somehow acquired. It was half-built and clearly complex. I could see, even without understanding the full plan, that this was something he'd been thinking about for a long time. "What is it?" I asked, from the doorway. He glanced up. The usual careful assessment. A model of the building across the street. I looked at it more carefully. The proportions, the window placement, the specific shape of the roofline were all there, rendered in cardboard with a precision that was genuinely impressive for a 10-year-old. "Can I come in?" I asked. A pause. "Okay." I sat on the floor, the way you sit when you want someone to understand you're not in a hurry to leave. "The window spacing is really accurate. How did you figure that out without measuring?" He looked at me, and for the first time, the flatness shifted. Just slightly, the expression of someone being asked a question they hadn't expected. "I counted," he said. "Then I worked out the ratios. There are 7 windows on the 2nd floor, and the gap between them is consistent, so if you know the width of one window you can calculate everything else." "That's a systems approach," I said. "Most people would just eyeball it." "Eyeballing it is imprecise," he said, with the faint trace of what might have been disdain. I laughed, a real one, not performed. "You're right, it is." Something in the laugh registered differently than he expected. He didn't say anything else, but he also didn't go back to working in the pointed way that would have meant the conversation is over. He simply kept building, and I sat there, and for 20 minutes we occupied the same room without either of us managing it or protecting ourselves from it. It was the quietest and most important thing that had happened in 3 weeks. I want to describe what Claire Bennett had actually missed, not to judge her, but because understanding it mattered for everything I was trying to do. She had not been absent in the way you are absent when you are not home. She had been absent in the more insidious way, present in the room, but elsewhere in every sense that mattered to a child. Phone in hand at dinner. Half listening to stories about school, responding with, and the kind of automatic encouragement that tells a child, over time, that their experience is not registering anywhere that counts. Ethan had stopped telling her things by age 8. He had stopped trying to show her his projects by 8 and a half. By 9, he had stopped expecting her to notice when something had gone wrong at school, and by 10, the quiet self-containment Mrs. Park had described had become not a strategy but simply how he was. The personality of someone who had optimized around a consistent absence until the optimization itself had become the person. What I was dealing with was not a child who had decided to be cruel. It was a child who had decided, in the most reasonable possible response to the information available to him, that other people were unreliable and that caring about their opinions was a cost with no corresponding return. Every cold, calculating thing the 18-year-old version of him did in the book could be traced, in a completely straight line, to this 10-year-old's entirely rational conclusion that warmth was a losing bet. My job was not to override that conclusion through force of will. My job was to make it wrong, repeatedly, consistently, over a long enough period that the evidence of its wrongness became impossible to ignore. I took Tuesday afternoons off work. I started attending his school events, not the required ones, the optional ones nobody tracked. I learned the names of 2 other children in his class. I asked him, every day, one genuine question about his day, not, how was school, but a specific question, the kind that required him to have been paying attention to his own life to answer. He began, slowly, to answer them. I am going to move through the next 6 months more quickly than I lived them, because the individual moments, while each one mattered more than I can fully convey, would take far longer to describe than they are useful to recount here. What matters is the shape of what changed. It changed slowly. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where a child's fundamental orientation toward the world shifts dramatically after a single meaningful conversation would be comforting and entirely false. What actually happened was more like watching ice melt in early spring, nothing visible for long stretches, and then one day you notice the surface has changed, and you can't point to the moment it happened because it was never one moment. In the first month, the changes were almost entirely invisible. He answered my daily questions in slightly more than 3 words. He said good night when he went to bed, instead of simply disappearing in the direction of his room. He brought me a cup of tea, once, without explanation, setting it beside my laptop with the same careful precision he brought to everything and then walking away without waiting to be thanked. An act so small, so easily missed, that I almost missed it. I did not miss it. I said thank you clearly and without making more of it than the gesture warranted, because something in me understood, by then, that the correct response to a small trust was to receive it proportionally and not startle it with gratitude disproportionate to the risk taken. By the end of the 2nd month, he had started leaving his bedroom door open while he worked on his projects. This is not, I understand, an event anyone else in his life would have noticed. But I noticed it, because I understood what it meant. Not an invitation, exactly, but a rescission of a deliberate closure. He was leaving a gap he could close again quickly if he needed to, but was no longer certain he would need to. I started, around this time, doing my own evening reading in the small chair near the hallway, rather than in my office with the door closed. Not intrusively. I didn't hover in his doorway or narrate what I was doing. I simply moved my location, so that the house felt occupied in the evenings in a different, quieter way than it had when we were both separately behind closed doors. It took 2 weeks before he seemed to register it. Then one evening he asked, from his desk, without looking up, what I was reading. I told him. He said, and went back to his work. It was the most unimportant exchange in the world. It was also the first time he had initiated any contact between us that wasn't in direct response to something I'd said or done first. By the end of the 3rd month, he had told me, unbidden, about a problem he'd had with another student at school. Not the sanitized version children offer when they expect a lecture, but the actual version, with his own behavior included, and the specific unfairness he'd felt about the outcome. I listened without immediately problem-solving it. I said what I actually thought, which included acknowledging the place where he'd made things worse and the place where the situation had genuinely been unfair to him. And I watched him process the experience of being heard accurately rather than managed carefully. By the end of the 4th month, he had a friend. A real one. A boy named Marcus, quiet and methodical in ways that apparently complemented Ethan's own particular brand of self-containment, who came over on weekends and participated in the model building projects with a seriousness Ethan visibly found satisfying. I made lunch for both of them on these Saturdays and asked them questions about what they were building, and listened to the answers, and Ethan, without quite seeming to notice he was doing it, began, in those conversations, to use the word we about a project for the first time I had ever heard. I want to dwell on that word for a moment, because I think it deserves more than passing mention. We is not a word a child uses casually. It implies a project that belongs to more than one person, a collaboration genuine enough to have an owner who is not singular. For a boy who had spent 4 years becoming fluent in the language of self-containment, of things that belonged to him alone because things that involved other people too often ended with the other person leaving, we was not a small word. It was a risk taken in ordinary language, and I heard it land every time, and I never once drew attention to it, because drawing attention to it would have been exactly the kind of thing that makes a person stop using a word. I want to be honest about month 5, because month 5 was the hardest, and the hardest parts of stories like this are the ones that usually get compressed or skipped entirely in service of the better ending. There was a week, in the 5th month, when Ethan came home from school silent in a way that was different from his usual managed quiet, a heavier silence, the silence of someone who had been hurt and had not yet decided what to do with the hurt. I asked my usual question. He gave a single-word answer. I did not push. 2 days later, he told me what had happened. A falling out with Marcus, over something small that had escalated in the way small things escalate between children, and Marcus had said something, in the heat of the moment, that Ethan had clearly been turning over in his mind for 48 hours. He said I only let him be my friend because I needed someone to help with the projects. Ethan said, flat, careful, the flatness I recognized now as the specific texture of a wound he wasn't sure it was safe to show me. Did you? I asked. He looked at me. No. Then what do you want to do about what he said? I don't know, he said, after a long pause. Quote. In the past I would have just stopped. It's easier to stop than to fix things. I know, I said. I used to think that too, about a lot of things. It was true, though not in any way I could explain to him. Is he worth the harder choice? He thought about it for a long time. Yes, he said, finally. I think so. Then you already know what to do, I said. He talked to Marcus the following Monday. I don't know exactly what was said, that was his conversation, not mine, and some things belong entirely to the people having them. What I know is that Marcus was at the apartment the following Saturday, and when I brought them lunch, Ethan introduced him to me properly, by name, with the specific small pride of someone choosing to include another person in something that matters, and I understood, watching it happen, that something genuinely real had grown between them, tested and survived. 4 months in, Ethan mentioned, as casually as he mentioned everything, the studied casualness of a child who had learned that appearing not to care was safer than appearing to care, that there was a school science fair in 3 weeks. He mentioned it on a Wednesday evening, at the kitchen table, during homework. Not looking up, a statement dropped into the air between us with the specific, practiced nonchalance of a child giving a person one chance to respond correctly before filing the information under things not worth bringing up. Are you entering? I asked. A pause. Still not looking up. Maybe. What would you build? He glanced at me then, the assessment, brief. A model of the water distribution system for this block. I've been thinking about it for a while. The pipes are visible from the street in 3 places, and if you know the elevation differences and the typical water pressure for the area, you can calculate the full system. That sounds genuinely impressive, I said. What would you need? He told me, somewhat guardedly, monitoring, I thought, whether the interest was real or performative. I asked follow-up questions that could only have been asked by someone actually listening to the answers, and by the end of the conversation he was explaining, with the same contained precision he'd used about the window ratios, exactly how he planned to model the pressure dynamics. I'd like to come, I said, at the end. To the fair, if that's okay. Another pause, longer this time. It's on a Thursday, he said. You usually have meetings Thursday afternoon. I'll move them, I said. He looked at me for a moment, the careful, checking look. Then he went back to his homework without saying anything else. He won 2nd place at the science fair. I was in the front row of the gymnasium, beside Marcus's mother, who I had by then met properly and who told me, with the frank warmth of a parent who says what she thinks, that Marcus had started talking about Ethan at home in the easy, constant way children talk about the people who matter to them, and that this was a recent development she wanted me to know about. When they called Ethan's name for the 2nd place ribbon, he looked for me in the crowd before he went up to collect it. Not dramatically, just a quick scan of the room, quick enough that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I saw it. I waved. He took the ribbon and went back to his table, and when he sat down, something in his posture was different from the way he'd been sitting for the past hour. Less contained, slightly more open, the way a person's body changes when it has received, without any fuss, exactly the confirmation it was quietly looking for. I understood, watching it, that he had expected me not to come. That some part of him had been prepared, from the moment he mentioned the fare at the kitchen table, for the disappointment of looking out from that gymnasium stage and finding the seat empty. I thought about the filing cabinet. The unfollowed note from the teacher who had asked for a conversation about how he was doing. All the small, accumulated absences that had added up, over 10 years, to a child who had simply stopped expecting to find anyone where he'd hoped to find them. I thought, that's over. That part is over now. 5 months in, Ethan asked me, on a Saturday morning, whether I wanted to help with a new project. I want to record this moment carefully because I think it was the most significant thing that happened, in 7 months of significant small things, and also the easiest to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. He had never asked before. In every previous project, I had found my way in through a question, an observation, a careful permission requested from the doorway. He had tolerated my presence, then allowed it, then in some sense welcomed it, but always passively, always leaving the initiation to me, always in the position of someone responding to being sought rather than doing the seeking. This was different. He came to me. I'm building something new, he said, standing in the kitchen doorway on Saturday morning while I made coffee, his project journal open in his hands. It's more complicated than the water system model. I was wondering if you wanted to help figure out the structural problem. You're better at math than I thought. The last sentence arrived with the same flat delivery he applied to most things, but I had, by then, learned to hear what was underneath the delivery. You're better at math than I thought was Ethan Cole, for I've been paying attention to you. I've noticed things about you. I want to include you in something that matters to me. Show me the problem, I said. He sat down at the kitchen table, across from me, and opened the journal to a page of calculations and small diagrams, and we spent the next 2 hours working through a structural design problem I only half understood, but that he walked me through with the patient, precise attention he had apparently always been capable of giving to things he cared about. I thought, sometime in the second hour, about the 18-year-old in the book. About the cold, methodical dismantling of other people's worlds that the story had described with such care. About the chapter that had sketched his background in a single paragraph and moved on, because backstories were just context, and the real story was somewhere else. I thought about how much the real story had actually been right here, in a kitchen, on a Saturday morning, with a 10-year-old who had just, for the first time, crossed the room to ask for company rather than waiting to have it offered. The book had gotten the architecture of the villainy right. It had simply never asked why the architecture existed. I knew why. I had spent 7 months carefully, quietly, brick by brick, building something different in the same space. The moment I want to tell you about most carefully happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, 7 months after I had woken up in Claire Bennett's kitchen holding a cup of cold coffee. We were doing what had, by then, become a habit, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, Ethan working on something for school, me with my laptop, the specific comfortable quiet of two people who had found a way to be in the same room together without either of them needing to manage it. He looked up from his work. Of course, I said. Did something happen? He asked. To you. Earlier this year. Because he paused, searching for words with the care he applied to most things. You're different than you were. Not bad different, just different, like you decided to pay attention to things you weren't paying attention to before. I sat with that for a moment, because it deserved a real answer rather than a deflection. Something did happen, I said, honestly. I can't explain all of it. But yes, something happened, and I understood some things I hadn't understood before. About what mattered, about what I'd been missing. He looked at me for a long moment. I'm glad it happened, he said. Simply, without ceremony, the way children sometimes say enormous things. I know that sounds weird to say. But I am. I did not cry in front of him, though I came close. I said, me too. More than you know. He went back to his homework. I went back to my laptop. And the evening continued, quietly and completely, in the way evenings do when the people inside them have stopped waiting for something to go wrong. It has been 2 years. Ethan is 12 now, taller, less contained in the specific way that 2 years of consistent, genuine attention produces in a child who had previously decided the world was not safe enough to expand into. He still builds models, still approaches problems with the same methodical systems thinking that once struck Mrs. Park as remarkable. He has simply, now, added people to the list of things worth paying careful, genuine attention to. He has 3 friends. Marcus is still one of them. The other 2 arrived over the past year, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that friendships arrive when a person stops managing their distance from the world so carefully, through proximity, through shared interest, through the accumulated weight of small interactions that compound into something real. There was a conversation, a few months ago, that I keep returning to. We were driving home from a weekend trip, a small thing, 2 days in a town a few hours away that I had planned without making a ceremony of it, simply saying one morning that I'd booked a couple of nights somewhere if he wanted to come. He had wanted to come. On the drive back, he was quiet in the specific, comfortable way he was quiet now, not the managed quiet of someone monitoring the emotional weather of a room, but the easy quiet of someone who was simply thinking and knew, without needing to verify it, that the silence was safe. "Can I ask you something?" he said, after a long stretch of motorway. "Always," I said. "Do you ever think about what I would have been like," he said, "if things had been different? Before, when you were different." I thought about how to answer that honestly without answering it more completely than I could. "Sometimes," I said. "I think about it sometimes. I think you would have been very capable, regardless. You were always capable, but different," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "I think different." "I think so too," he said. "I think I was. I was getting very good at not needing anyone. I thought that was a strength." He paused, the careful pause of someone finding their way to a thought they haven't said aloud before. "I think it would have made me good at certain things and very bad at others. Things that matter more." I kept my eyes on the road. "What changed your mind?" I asked. "About the not needing anyone thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You kept showing up," he said, finally. "I kept expecting you to stop, and you didn't. After a while, I ran out of reasons to keep assuming you would." I thought about the filing cabinet. The unfollowed teacher's note. The specific, accumulated arithmetic of small absences that had been building, in the original story, toward an inevitable conclusion. "I'm glad I didn't stop," I said. "Me too," he said, and went back to looking out the window, and the motorway continued, and the evening came on gradually in the ordinary, unremarkable way of evenings in a life where the people inside it have stopped waiting for something to go wrong. I cannot know, with certainty, whether the version of Ethan who grows up in this life will become the man the book described. I want to be honest about that uncertainty, because I think the version of this story that claims perfect prevention would be dishonest in a way that doesn't serve anyone. What I know is that the specific conditions that produced that man, the loneliness, the learned contempt for warmth, the years of mounting evidence that other people were unreliable, are no longer the conditions Ethan is growing up inside. I know that when something goes wrong for him now, he tells me. I know that he has learned, over 2 years, that bringing a problem to someone else doesn't diminish it, it distributes it, and distributed weight is lighter than weight carried alone. I know that he understands this now not because I told him but because I demonstrated it, repeatedly, imperfectly, in the specific unglamorous way that the most important things are usually learned. I don't know what happened to me in the life before this one. I stopped trying to understand it around the 8-month mark, when it became clear that the question was not going to resolve itself, and that spending energy on it was a way of not spending it on the person in the next room. What I know is this. Somewhere, in a story I once read, a boy grew up believing that no one would ever stay. That warmth was a performance people put on until it became inconvenient. That boy still exists, in that book, on those pages. I cannot reach him, but I am in a different story now. And in this one, the boy in the next room is 12 years old and building something at the kitchen table while I make dinner, and every so often he looks up and says something, about the project, about school, about something Marcus told him that he found funny, and it is, in the most specific and complete sense of the phrase, the most ordinary thing in the world. It always should have been. That turns out to be the whole of it. I know that when something goes wrong for him now, he tells me. Not immediately, not always, not in the perfectly articulate way of a child in a movie, but eventually, in the particular, roundabout way of a child who is still learning that bringing things to someone else doesn't require perfect words. I know that he talks about Marcus the way people talk about a friendship they expect to last, the easy, assumed permanence of someone who no longer believes that the things he builds will inevitably be taken away. I know that he laughed, last month, at something I said, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a person who is not monitoring themselves, and it was the kind of small sound that contains, if you know what you're listening for, an entire changed world inside it. I don't know what happened to me, in whatever life I lived before I woke up in Claire Bennett's kitchen. I stopped trying to understand it around the 8-month mark, when it became clear that the question was not going to resolve itself and that spending my energy on it was a way of not spending it on the person in the next room, who needed it considerably more than any unanswerable question did. What I know is this. Somewhere, in a story I once read, a boy grew up believing that no one would ever stay. That warmth was a performance people put on until it became inconvenient, and then they left, and the space where the warmth had been was colder than if there had never been any warmth at all. That boy still exists, in that book, on those pages. I cannot reach him. I cannot change that story. But I am in a different story now, and in this one, the boy in the next room knows, not because I've told him in those words, but because 2 years of consistent evidence have made the knowledge as reliable as any other demonstrated fact, that I am not going anywhere. That turns out to be the whole of it.